Just a quick question. What language do you prefer? Is there anyone who English? Okay, then it's going to be English. Quick and easy. Thanks for the feedback. Okay, so welcome everybody to the second day of the SWA Camp Unconference. Thank you very much for having me as a keynote speaker. And the topic I'm going to talk about today is something I have been, well, let's say, dealing with and thinking about for quite some time now. I always was like, well, I should do a talk about that someday. And maybe some of you have seen me doing some DDD and microservices talks and whatnot. And I thought that would be a good occasion today for a keynote to do a brand new topic. There is a lot of talk about domain-driven design lately. And one of the things that is always a little bit under the radar are actually the cultural and organizational parts that come along with domain-driven design. And they are actually very interesting, especially given the current tendency in the IT industry. I think the biggest shift that we see now is basically we could discuss that about technologies here, cloud and microservices and Kafka and Scala and whatnot. Nice. We could discuss that with agile. Yeah, Scrum here, Kanban there, Lean over there, design thinking, and so on. Nice. But I think that the general movement in the IT industry nowadays is about decentralization. If you look at all the fancy stuff that we are discussing today, stuff like continuous delivery, microservices, all the agile ideas, the DevOps movement, all of them aim at decentralizing the IT world. So going away from I would say a rather centralized world in terms of operations, in terms of how we specify things, in terms of how we cut services, we see a strong tendency towards decentralization. And I think domain-driven design offers us quite a few things around that, and also a little bit of a cultural and organizational impact to that. And this is exactly what I want to discuss today. Just a few words about myself. My name is Plöd. I'm a principal consultant at InnoQ, and well, I've been busy in the DDD space for quite some time now, and I do a couple of talks about that stuff and so on, but I have to pay you respect where it's due. I am by far not the inventor of domain-driven design or anything like that. I'm just a fanboy, so to say, and a practitioner, so to say, and most of the things that I will mention today come from those two books, and I allowed myself to add my 2 cents here and there along the way throughout this presentation today. So first things first, domain-driven design is really old. That's nothing new. The book by Eric came out 15 years ago. I mean, that's quite amazing, isn't it? Usually when an IT book gets released, it gets tossed to the back of the shelf quite easily after 2 years, 3 years or something. And quite few books stand the test of time and stand still relevant. And I would say that the relevance of the domain-driven design space is growing, and growing. But one thing that's very important to me is some of those things that are in Eric's book were written 15 years ago. No one was talking about stuff like DevOps. No one was talking a lot about continuous delivery and things like that back in the days. So I sometimes allow myself to combine those ideas together along the way. And as a starter, let's look at the so-called, I call it the domain-driven iceberg. Why the iceberg? As you know, there are some visible parts of an iceberg, and there are rather invisible parts of it. And actually, the biggest part of an iceberg is, first of all, invisible to us. So if we are those folks down there in this ship, what we see here is basically this visible part. And I think the same applies to domain-driven design. In the early days, we have talked a lot about the internal building blocks. Yeah, we've talked about the entities, the value objects, aggregates, services, repositories, how to build them. And at least from my own experience working with DDD in many projects, that has been a major part throughout the first 5 to 7 years of the DDD community. However, and the funny thing is, if you read Eric's book, he started with those chapters. The first chapters in the DDD book were about those things back there. He called them the internal building blocks. As far as I heard, there's a quote by Eric saying that if he would write the book again, he would shuffle the chapters in a different order. Because the very interesting, I mean, this stuff is quite developer-centric. Yeah? I wouldn't discuss aggregates with business folks, to be honest, or entities or repositories or something like that, because they're like, oh no, the IT guys, they're so nerdy again. What are all those terms, yeah? But there has been a shift in the perception of DDD throughout the years, and especially with the rise of microservices. Suddenly, a construct called the bounded context became quite prominent. It became quite important along the way. Why? The bounded context is the boundary around the meaning of a model. And this brings me back to the part where we talk about decentralization. Basically, the idea of the bounded context is to decentralize business models. And one thing that I always talk about when I talk with customers of mine is when they start ramping up all those shiny new cloud platforms, for instance. Yeah? So they start off with Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry and so on and so forth. And I always tell them, yeah, that's nice if you go cloud native with your software stack, with your technology stack and so on. And if you put the stuff on those fancy, shiny new platforms, that's nice. But it won't go a long way. Yeah? It's like having a Porsche car, but with the motor of a lawnmower inside. Yeah? It drives, yeah? It works, but it's not as fast as you want it to be, because the model in those applications might still be very tightly coupled together. It might still have this centralized thinking, and the idea of the bounded context was to introduce a decentralization in terms of business models. Now, going forward from there, a lot of new stuff emerged, like all the event storming, event sourcing, CQRS, and whatnot topics arose. So, for instance, in Vaughn's book, there have been dedicated chapters about event sourcing. He's talking a lot about CQRS. There has been, like with Alberto Brandolini's book about event storming, a lot of talk about that. And finally, we also had, I think especially recently, a lot of discussion about the context maps. And this is where it gets interesting from an organizational point of view. Because what the context map does, it looks at relationships between systems, teams, or bounded contexts. And it goes ways further than the stuff we usually work with in terms of a lot of the enterprise architecture diagrams. The context map explicitly takes organizational, political, and power dynamics into account. Yeah? For instance, if you look at, let's say, the customer-supplier pattern here, that says that a downstream team who is talking to some upstream team, let's say you're a bank and we have the SCHUFA. The SCHUFA offers us a service, yeah, report a credit or get a SCHUFA ranking for a certain customer. And what can the bank do to influence that service? Can they influence the service? Can you go to the SCHUFA and say, hey, we're bank XYZ, we have a lot of money, and we want to change that to a very specific thing? Usually, that doesn't work. If you have a very big chunk of money, it may eventually work, yeah? But haven't you seen that in your organizations where one team wants to change something and another team says, nah, we don't have the budget, we don't have the time, we don't have the staffing or whatever in order to deal with that change? You can't do that. You have to move that to a different thing. And that's exactly a customer-supplier behavior, that a downstream team has a veto right. And that brings us to the rather invisible parts that domain-driven design is talking about. And I would say the icing on the DDD cake are actually, in my eyes, the invisible parts of it. I mean, all the stuff that I've just been talking about is really interesting, very important, and you're not making a lot of mistakes if you adopt those things. But at its essence, domain-driven design is not about technology. Yeah? It's not about the fanciest frameworks and so on. I would say that domain-driven design actually loves cultural and organizational aspects. If we take a look at cultural aspects, and if we talk to the DDD community, if we look into the books, we actually find quite a few interesting takes in there. For instance, domain-driven design is very strongly about continuous learning. So domain-driven design already assumes that we don't know everything after the first design iteration. It actually implies that we will learn new stuff along the way. So for instance, I've been writing various scoring engines for various banks in credit processes as a developer. And one thing that I actually realized doing that for various customers, that my view on the business core of scoring actually changed throughout the time. Yeah? I learned new stuff along the way. I learned to make better design decisions. And another thing is that the market may change. So we start with a new product. So we have this shiny, fancy MVP right out of the design thinking processes in a really fancy office done by some amazing interior design designers and so on. Yeah, like this super fancy agile whatever stuff. And we start our MVP. It hits the market and we suddenly learn, our customers have a totally different behavior than that. Yeah? We didn't assume that. And domain-driven design doesn't punish you for getting that, I would say, for getting that experience. It's rather than, okay, that's an interesting learning. We have to pick up on that and we need to change our view. Yeah? We need to adapt to the market. Another thing, DDD is a highly iterative approach. So it's actually iterative by design. So especially in combination with the continuous learning, if it weren't iterative, we couldn't learn continuously. So that's a no-brainer, so to say. And the very interesting thing is refactoring. In Eric's book, there is a chapter with no disrespect to Eric, with a rather esoterical name called Refactoring Towards a Deeper Insight. And as a little bit strange as the name of the chapter might sound, as important it actually is. What Eric implies there, that if we learn new stuff along the way, if we change the names of things, domain-driven design is a lot about a ubiquitous language that we work in a decentralized context, that we want to reflect those changes directly into the code. So if we realize that, for instance, a bounded context is too big, that we actually need to split this up into two bounded contexts, we want to reflect this in the code as fast as possible. If you consolidate a name for some things to something new, to something better, you want to refactor your code in order to match that naming. The ubiquitous language is all about, first of all, being valid inside of one context, but also about, very strongly, about the fact that we want to, match the language in a project with our code base, with the documentation, and so on. And another thing that is, in my eyes, a very central and integral part is empathy. Yes, nowadays we talk a lot about empathy in various areas in the agile world and in the way we deal with each other, and there is a lot of focus on that. I want to put the focus on empathy here, on the way that we talk with other stakeholders in a project. Yeah? There is a funny picture in the internet, and it's like a picture of a room, and there are various names for things. So for instance, there is a couch in that room. And the funny thing about the picture is how developers would name those things. For instance, the couch is a bad bug aggregator or something like that. Yeah? And the window is a transparency manager or something like that. Yeah? Those are, I see the laughter in the crowd. Yeah, those are the ways that we sometimes name things when we stick to our environment. Yeah? In German, I don't know the English translation for that, so please excuse me, but in German it's like, wenn wir in unserer Suppe kochen, when we cook in our own soup. It's a little bit dodgy in terms of the translation, but in the end, we need to look beyond that. Yeah? We as developers, and I always say that especially this is a software architecture unconference here, the most important part and the most important task for a software architect is not technology and not having the latest, greatest shiny toys at the table. It is about communication. How we are able to communicate with other stakeholders in our project. So Gregor Hoppe called that in his amazing book, I think 37 things on software architecture know about IT transformations. He called it the architecture elevator. Yeah? So sometimes we need to talk to a senior management, but we also need to go down to the machine room at some place and talk with the engineers and the mechanics and stuff like that. So we need to be able to talk different languages. And this is, in my eyes, where the empathy starts. We need to find a way that we are able to talk with various stakeholders, especially domain experts, on par. Yeah? So that means we need to get deeper into the business and learn their language. But on the other hand, it also means that they need to get a little bit closer to the IT people. I mean, which project nowadays isn't about a digital product? None. It's this typical German term, Digitalisierung. Yeah? So, does that sound familiar to you? I mean, the things I've been talking about? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Let me look at it from a different perspective. One sentence that I like a lot about domain-driven design is this quote: "The domain should be the heart of a system." What does that mean? We go through an iterative approach and approach it with a certain attitude. Yeah? So we focus on continuous learning instead of fixed specifications. We focus on attitude instead of fixed project templates. We focus on engineering and not on technologies. And we focus on culture and not on default practices. I have a very nice quote from that, which I heard, I think, a couple of years ago, 8 years ago, at a bank in northern Germany. Mr. Plöd, it's not about making sense. We have our processes. Yeah? I was like, thanks for that one. I'll remember that for various conference talks. And I think that's an excellent quote, to be honest, because it's actually, it resembles what domain-driven design is actually not about. We want to find a solution that fits perfectly to a certain business domain. And what I often heard in projects, I called this person the chief whatever architect, is a quote like that. Yeah, you're not doing domain-driven design if you're not strictly sticking to entities, value objects, aggregates, and a hexagonal architecture. Yeah, I had some other terms written there, but I decided to play it nice. Yeah, and unfortunately, that's an original quote that I actually heard in a project. So that's actually, if you approach things with that attitude on a cultural level, you're basically centralizing things again towards a centralized architecture blueprint, and we try to shove it over every problem. So we try to torture domain-driven design towards a problem, that is not suitable, for instance, for an hexagonal architecture approach. So please see this slide as a simple example for those things. So for instance, yes, the aggregates, entities, value objects in DDD are very powerful. But they are especially powerful if you have a complex problem that you want to solve. If visibility is really important, if internal decoupling is really important to you. Yes, there are problems where this stuff comes in really handy. But don't we always have other bounded contexts where we just capture a form and write it to a database? Yeah? Simple stuff. Yeah? So why would I go ahead and squeeze this behemoth of a solution that the hexagon architecture is, without a doubt, over this really simple problem? In my eyes, that would be utterly stupid to do. And the other thing is, don't we have bounded context, or haven't you all worked with some code bases or some problems where actually the logic, the essence of the business relies in the most sophisticated possible query? Yeah? I had quite a few occasions where a lot of the logic, a lot of the thinking, a lot of the brain work was actually in finding the best possible database access for queries, that they are performant, that they are fast, but that we don't actually mess up the right performance or something like that. Yeah. So you may want to find a different solution for that as well. And in my eyes, the most, I would say, domain-driven decision you can make is that you realize what kind of a problem you have, and that you adapt the real suitable solution for that. Yeah. Yeah.
I just have a question.
Sure.
Go back to that slide.
Yeah.
I have a little question about, this is not concurrent things which are conflicting with each other, and it's also not domains, because the three things we see here is on different levels. The last thing is on process level.
Yeah.
The middle thing is about the contract.
Yeah.
And one of the contracts is CRUD.
Absolutely. Yeah. It means I usually work with categories for certain bounded contexts, and you have bounded contexts that are on a higher process level, for instance. Then you have others that are data-driven, and I think for me this slide is just an example for that quote over there. Yeah. So please think about
the domain still sticks into the business.
Sure. Absolutely.
The CRUD part is not even part of the business.
Sure.
It's technology.
Yeah, it's technology. Yeah, but please find a solution that is suitable for the given problem that you have.
For the given problem.
Yeah.
For the given domain.
Yeah.
That was what I got wrong.
Okay. No worries. No worries about. Anyways, feel free to toss in questions and so on. That's highly welcome from my side. Another thing that we need to realize is that we as architects and developers are not alone in our projects. Yes, we'd love to be alone. I know, yeah? We'd really love that. Yeah, so, come on, the business folks, the project management. Let me just write my code, and yeah, wouldn't that be nice? Unfortunately, that's not the real world. So let's talk a little bit about stakeholders. In my eyes, we usually work with a various group of stakeholders. Yeah, we have the requirements engineers, we have a testing team, we have operations, we have project management, we have a senior management that's responsible for giving us the budget for a given project, and so on. And us as architects, we really need to talk with all of those folks. I want to focus on the three in the middle at first. So when we talk about the relationship between developers and architects, there is between developers, architects, and business domain experts. There obviously needs to be some sort of an overlap between them. Yeah? So there needs to be some communication because we as developers or architects are not domain experts. I mean, yes, some of us may have a really sound knowledge about certain business domains, be it insurance, be it banking, be it autonomous driving or whatever you may have there. So, but there needs to be some overlap between the software engineering part and the domain know-how part. One way that many organizations try to solve that is they create a requirements engineering team or a requirements engineering organization and put them between the developers and the domain experts. So, and this strongly depends how strict you play that. I know quite a few organizations where there is where between those parts, there would be a really tough wall. So you as a developer, dare you to contact the business directly. Dare you, yeah? You're losing your commit rights for a month for doing that, yeah? Others are, I would say, more, I would say, more open to that. So they say, okay, let the requirements engineering do the major part of the job, but for detailed discussions, it's totally okay for the developers to go directly or have a direct access to a domain expert. In the end, I think the DDD part plays exactly in that role. And this is extremely important in terms of domain-driven design. So I have mentioned some technical things at the beginning and with the CRUD and the query and whatnot stuff. Yeah? But I think the essence of domain-driven design is actually a tight collaboration of domain experts with technical teams. And the more our CEOs, CIOs, and whatever O's talk about Digitalisierung nowadays, yeah, this gets more and more important because they both need to move together. And I think the responsibility is not just on the side of the technical folks here, but also on the domain experts. So it needs to come from both sides. And this is where the empathy thing comes into play again. Because I think most of the developers and architects that I see understand that they need to get a better understanding of the business. I would say that's the major part. I also see a large part of the business folks, I would say of the real business folks, actually wanting developers really close by them so that they can work with prototypes. I've seen that at a bank a couple of years ago where the business actually wanted to work very directly with the developers. They asked the IT department, the CTO, hey, can't you send us 5 developers over to our office? We need to figure some stuff out, how it works. We build a prototype, and based on that, we then initiate a product. But the IT organization was strictly against that. They say, no, we can't do that. That's not compliant with our process, and who knows what gets created there, and so on. I think, yeah, yeah. Who? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, process over everything. No, but in the end, I think we all know how that went down. It didn't go down well. Yeah, and so the question is this requirements engineering? I call it always the requirements engineering proxy. Actually, DDD compliant. I mean, I don't like the term DDD compliant or compliance or something like that a lot, but it was the best I could come up with. So how would that work? I think a strict proxy organization that effectively blocks the two away from each other is really a bad thing. I don't think that is a good idea, that will work in the long run. Because what I've seen with those folks very often, that they suddenly start their own business strategy. There they pick up some stuff from the business and they make something up from it. They talk to the developers. And in the end, I think in such settings, what I very often see is that software gets released to production where many parts of the organization think, nah, that's actually not the thing that we really need. Yeah, it's sort of okay, but there is a gap. And I think this is where something like product ownership comes into place. Yeah? We all, I think all of you have heard of or worked in a so-called Scrum environment, haven't you? And there is a role called the product owner in between. Yeah? And the part, I mean, what does the term actually imply? That means ownership over a given product on the technical side, but also on the business side. So if we put that requirement engineering role very close and on a very, I would say, goal-oriented way into play in such a process, I've seen that working quite well. But however, there are different kinds of product ownerships in many organizations. The one that I see is, I call that the just another fancy job title product owner for a classic project manager who's just tracking timesheets, dealing with budget, and monitoring developer productivity, so to say. Or a real product ownership, where those folks really drive a given product forward in terms of the real outcome. And I think this helps a lot in such environments. Yeah? So they can be a very powerful, so to say, proxy. But they would never say, you're only allowed to talk to me. They would include domain experts and business experts as they are available into, I would say, writing user stories, doing backlog groomings, and so on and so forth. So to summarize that, I think you remember that quote? I don't like that idea. Yeah, I still stick to that. In my eyes, the birthplace of the cultural and organizational aspects of DDD come into play when we involve domain experts very closely, yeah, when we move those boundaries together. Yeah, I've chosen that image here very wisely. That's a glacier in Greenland, which is basically the birthplace of icebergs. So the glacier is moving to the sea and icebergs are breaking off into the sea from that one. And this is basically the birthplace of DDD is the close involvement of the domain experts. So in my eyes, if you manage to get a very close collaboration on an organizational level between domain experts, developers, and other parts, it helps, it goes a long way in terms of adapting other parts of domain-driven design. And one thing that is very important to me, I personally see domain-driven design as a toolbox. Yeah, I don't like the term, this black and white seeing, like you are doing domain-driven design if you have that maturity checklist. For instance, yeah, you have bounded contexts, you have a context map in place, you have a ubiquitous language documented in a wiki, and so you're strictly working with aggregates. Choose the tools that help you with your problems. But I think one of the first things where I would say that is extremely important, that's more important than all the other stuff, is the close involvement of domain experts. I remember Von Vernon once writing on Twitter about the question, when are you doing domain-driven design, is the question, how easy can you get to talk to a domain expert? If it's extremely easy for you, then the chances are very high that you are in that place. When it's totally impossible for you because you have to break down various organizational boundaries, it will get really tough and you're, in the end, just stuck to some patterns. Yeah? I mean, they are good patterns. They go a long way. But you remember my analogy with the Porsche? Yeah, it looks nice. You can say, we are doing that. But it's not driving that fast as it would make fun, to be honest. And my boss wanted to have a law too. And he called it the Tilkov wants a law too law. And he said in a little bit a similar talk, but from a different perspective, not from a DDD perspective, he wrote down the quality of a system's architecture is inversely proportional to the number of bottlenecks limiting its evolution, development, and operations. And let's take that idea and look again at a couple of things. Yeah, we have our developers, architects. That's our home turf here. On the other hand, we have some business and domain experts. But on the other hand, we have the operations as well. And if we bring those things together, we say that the collaboration between the developers and the domain experts is very nicely coupled to by domain-driven design. Basically, the core message is, hey, please move closer together. Please work closer together. Please talk a lot to each other. Anyone remembers a similar message towards different stakeholders, the operations folks? DevOps. Basically, what's the key message behind DevOps? Yeah, you build a system, and we don't want the classical fence where we throw some stuff over. Hey, operations, please run that in production. Have fun with the monitoring and have fun on your late night call duties and so on. We're going to the bar now. The developers, greetings. That's not what DevOps is about. Yeah? DevOps is about we want to tear down that wall and move the development and the operations of things closer together in order to limit bottlenecks. And in the end, the key message of both ideas is extremely similar. And this brings me to another very popular topic nowadays in the IT space: continuous delivery. How can we continuously learn and refactor towards a deeper insight, as Eric called it, if we don't have automated tests? Yeah? Yeah? All those things that DDD wants on a cultural level can be strongly supported if we run or if we have a continuous delivery culture. I mean, yes, the automated deployment to some environments is a part of that, but the automation also goes a long way for tests. Continuous delivery usually works strongly with acceptance tests, integration tests, and explorative testing, for instance. And I think especially the idea of acceptance testing, yeah, where we discuss the acceptance tests with the domain experts, yeah, where we have test scenarios, yeah, all the BDD stuff from the behavior-driven development, that plays in really nicely with many of the cultural ideas of domain-driven design. So in my eyes, to sum that up in the end, DDD really sits in the center between software engineering, domain logic, and many, many ideas from the agile world. So it actually sits directly in the middle, and it takes up many ideas from those three areas. Yeah? And I think that is a really interesting thing, especially you as architects, if you want to pitch those ideas. If you realize that, for instance, this decentralized business model is a really good thing, and you need to pitch it to a rather senior management, I think going ahead and telling them, hey, listen, we have something sitting there. Yeah, you want to transform your organization to an agile organization. I mean, who does not want to do that nowadays on a senior level? Yeah, especially on the senior management. They always say, "How we need to get agile by the 1st of January in 2019. Yeah, we are agile now. Yeah, the others here, we need to get closer together in order to build better products. And merging all those three together, I think DDD would be a really good pitch. Yeah, because it picks up many ideas from all of those areas and consolidates them together in order to enable a really consolidated but decentralized approach for delivering software. And I think that's, in my eyes, the real essence of that topic here. Any questions? Yes, Gerd.
How long, in your experience, does it take until an organization gets from knowledge that there is DDD to the real embracement and real implementation of the ideas?
That's a really good question. In my eyes, it strongly depends on the attitude, on the culture of the organization. I've seen organizations which already have been working very much in the agile space. Yeah, they know that a sprint can fail, and they know that there is no big upfront specification, and they are not budgeting per year, but let's say they have a more agile budgeting process. For them, it's, I would say, quite easy, and you tell them the ideas and they say, hey, yeah, that's exactly our view of the world. That's nice. Let's pick that up, and it goes really a long way. If you're stuck in a very waterfall-driven organization, I mean, there is a lot of things that you can do there, but when this stuff up there, the agile part, is not present, yeah? All you can do is, the first thing, you can work in this part, yeah? You can say, hey, come on, let's do a prototyping phase as part of our waterfall process first in order to get a better specification. And I always like working in baby steps, and for them it takes ways longer, of course, because you need to pitch every single advantage. And you need to explain every single failure that comes along the way. Yeah, that's, one second, that's not a process that happens without failures. And what I always say in that organization, I call it the so-called the Empire Strikes Back phase. Yeah? You try to do things in a more agile, in a more modern way, and you have a failure, and the old organization comes along and says, yeah, we didn't have that screw up. Yeah, I mean, that's not better than us, and you have to fight that every time and discuss that every time. So it takes ways longer. Yeah, you had another question, or?
As you said, it's an excellent question. I
yeah.
have a remark on that too.
Yeah.
So in our logger, you see these 5 steps, yeah, and the 5th step is an organization completely accepts it. But there's 4 other steps to fail in, and you need to go through the 4 steps at least 10
yeah.
times
yeah.
to go to the 5th step.
And fail 20 times.
Exactly.
And explain every failure.
Exactly. So it depends on if the organization is failure ready and resilient enough
yeah.
after a failure to still try.
Yeah.
And if the organization is not capable of acting on failures, they will never reach it.
Yeah, so true. Yes, another question.
The question was, how long would it take to go to DDT? So you answered in some kind of metaphor.
Yeah.
Because you said depends if you are already
yeah.
agile or not. So my question would be more precise. If you're already agile, what do you think in terms of years or months? And also with the, let's say, far away organization.
I would say you can go a long way in such an environment in 6 months, and you can introduce some parts of it. I would never do a big bang introduction to those things. I would look into what are the tools in the DDD toolbox that help the organization the most. I would say the 2 most popular that I usually work with are either if I'm working as a coach or a consultant on a, I would say, very working level with development teams and domain experts, it would be the first thing I would try with them is something like event storming or domain storytelling and stuff like that in order to get them up to speed and in order to leverage the limited time of the domain experts. If I'm mostly working on a more management level, my favorite tool for doing that is the context map, because managers are always very much interested in how do I model power and political dynamics in an organization. And you can do that very nicely with the context map. And that's then the first thing that I would introduce to them. And with everything that I want to introduce, I want to have an improvement. That's at least my working approach. And and I usually choose one of the tools where I know that this will really improve things because it makes the next steps easier. So after you've done that, you go for the next step. And after 2 steps or something, you already have some DDD cultural aspects established. And from there you move forward. But I would say the first visible results usually come up after 4 to 6 months. And from there you can go. Usually in an agile organization, the more hierarchical an organization is, the more I tend to work with context maps as a starter. Yeah? Because hierarchical organizations are a lot about influence and a lot about politics. And this is where you can easily take certain stakeholders with you. Yeah? And they say, hey, that's a really helpful tool for me. And after that, I go more agile, because like the event storming thing with all the post-its, it's like, sometimes it feels like a little bit an agile cliche. Yeah, it's a post-it battle. Yeah, and I usually don't like to work a lot with cliches, and so I choose the tools that they are most familiar with, and then I usually go forward. But I would say in a non-agile organization, it will take at least 12 months.
Yeah. So I would expect more things like 3 years, 4 years, 5 years in total. So.
Until you are there, yeah. If that's your goal, it's definitely 3 to 5 years. Okay. Yeah, and you need a really strong commitment by the management, and for me the key, especially in very hierarchical organization, is the middle management. Yeah? And they need to buy into that, and they really need to support that. And you can only achieve that by going top down and bottom up on them. And that's a long process.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
Just like as a typical project, you're coming into a system where there is some clone domain knowledge with a startup, for example, and then you have a legacy software and you want to get new technology in it because it's needed. And I think one of the problems I always see is that the domain knowledge is not very well developed. Just like there are different perspectives, if nothing is consistent, just like, and now you get a role as a developer and as an architect to trigger a rework in the domain knowledge. And that is from my side sometimes the most critical part, and it's very hard to do that. Do you have any suggestions how to do that?
The first thing that I would try to get is a grip on a domain expert from the business side. Tell me what you are doing here. Why do you use the system? Where does it earn you money, for instance? Because most of the legacy systems where many organizations say, hey, we don't want to change that. No one knows what's in that host COBOL code anymore. The developers of that have already died, for instance. And or they are out of business, so to say, enjoying their rente. And I would try, the first thing that always helped me personally is try to understand why that system is so central. What kind of, how much money does it generate? And where is the bottleneck in terms, I usually don't approach that from a technological side. I always approach those questions from a value side. What's the value of the system to the organization, and where are the bottlenecks in terms of generating more value to the organization? And then I move into the bottlenecks and try to understand them. Why are they there? What were the reasons they were introduced? Were they introduced knowingly as a trade-off, for instance? Sometimes happens. Or are there new requirements that no one came up with 15 years ago? Fair enough. I mean, that stuff happens. And that's usually the approach that I take. I rarely work on a very technological side. I'm more on a value side. Yes?
So
And
if there is a capability map of business resources, business architecture, did you map this to a context map?
Sometimes, yes. But I mostly work with the context map in order to create I call it a decentralized governance model. Yeah? So which team can influence other teams? Yeah? So if you, for instance, have let's say, my favorite example, for instance, is if you have a retail mortgage loan application for houses and apartments. And you have one team for the form that captures that's the sales funnel, how I like to call it, yeah, where you fill out your application and stuff. And you have another team scoring the whole thing. Who has an influence on the actual form? Yeah? Is it the sales funnel team, or is it the scoring team? And what would the form look like if I switch power between the two? So if the sales funnel team has the power on the real form, it would be a really simple form, because they want to optimize for conversion rates. They want to sell a lot of stuff. They think in terms of e-commerce KPIs and metrics. On the other hand, the scoring team is totally risk-driven. So their idea is, hey, the stuff that we finance must be absolutely secured. Yeah, we can't take any risks. So credit risk is a big driver. So if they had a big say, the form would be very complicated, because they want to know a lot of things. And this is something that you can balance out with various, or that you can make visible or explicit with various patterns from the context map. So most banks, some of you have certainly done a mortgage loan with their bank and bought a house on that. The application form was quite complex, wasn't it? Yeah. So obviously the power lies with the risk management there, and not on the sales funnel team. Yeah. But you have choices there, and this is something that I want to make explicit. Of course, that correlates to capabilities to a certain degree. Yeah. You had another question.
Yes. I'm started reading about this DDD, and what I always not quite clear picture to me is that on one side say that architecture, software architecture, is about the things which are hard to change or costly to change. On the other hand, the main design, as you said, is some sort of evolutionary
Yes.
stuff. How does this fit together with it, saying that the hard things to change?
What I would say, why are many software architectures hard to change, or many software systems hard to change? This is especially valid for, I would say, historically or hysterically grown legacy systems. Yeah, you know, you have this big chunk of a system, and everyone's afraid to change things in there. It's because of the internal coupling of things. Yeah? Things are internally very, very strongly coupled together. So if you change something, you obviously have to change various other things. There is actually a term for that called connascence. Connascence means that if I change one thing, one component, which other component do I have to change as well? And I think an evolutionary architecture works with that very explicitly, that it internally goes ahead and already decouples things very strongly. And this is, for instance, where the ideas of the aggregates come into play. For instance, a best practice for aggregates in DDD is that they are a consistency boundary, that they are a transactional boundary already at an internal system level, that you go away from very big transactional boundaries into smaller ones, and that you work with eventual consistency between the two. And when you have something like that, when you have an internally decoupled architecture, you can easily refactor things out, especially in combination with a good test automation from the continuous delivery side. I think that goes very much hand in hand with each other. Of course, if you are in a situation where things are very strongly coupled, this doesn't enable you to do those continuous refactoring things. And another thing that most of those systems have is a very manual testing process with dedicated testing teams and so on. So I always call that the failure avoidance organization. So you invest a lot to avoid failures there. Then go in baby steps and refactor things in baby steps. And one thing that many folks usually do nowadays, they want to refactor their monolith to microservices. And their first step is, let's drag out a microservice out of that. And I would say, especially in very tightly coupled systems, I would usually refactor them internally first, introduce, for instance, stuff like aggregates with those ideas, and then start pulling out microservices out of those. That usually works very well as well. Okay, yes?
But therefore you have to understand your terms. So first of
Yes.
all, you should start with the business and figure out
Yeah.
DDD.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing there is, if you really want to go that way, pick as the first bigger refactoring a simple thing. Yeah, and don't fall into the trap and saying we choose the most complex part in order to prove that everything else will work, because you will fail with the most complex part probably, or in most cases. And because there are so many other learnings, such as a new operational model, new delivery model, and stuff like that, I would pick a simple business thing, pull it out, understand it, and then increase the business complexity in that process. You had another question back there.
Yeah, you said you were telling about companies being more on the putting down the risk of failure.
Mm-hmm.
There could be companies where I would really much appreciate if they do it like they did a nuclear plant.
Mm-hmm.
I pretty much like that it does not go astray and it does not make many failures. Would you change the approach in those systems, in those companies?
Let me quickly put a different slide on there. It's a quote by a really, really good and very old friend of mine. And I usually start all of my talks with this quote. Yeah? It's this one. Yeah? A developer should be like a werewolf, afraid of silver bullets. Domain-driven design is no silver bullet. So, for instance, if you work on a nuclear plant, if you work, I would say, if you're building commercial airplanes or something like that, I would say the influencing factors on projects automatically force you to a very rigid process, I would say. Yeah? And I think there are some aspects of domain-driven design that still work in such a rigid process. But obviously, the surrounding constraints that you have, they obviously limit the agility that you have. Yeah? And in those areas, I would, for instance, I've been talking a little bit critical about the aggregates. Yeah? But you will find solutions in there where this internal decoupling will also go a long way. So then you just pick out the tools that help you in those constraints. And then you leave out the rest. Yes? It's not about winning a prize on DDD compliance in projects. Yeah? It's about getting stuff done. And getting stuff done with a high involvement of everyone. Yeah? And if you realize, hey, that works, that's really good, do that. If you realize in my constraints, in my environment, you have problems, don't do it.
You have a very sensitive thing there. You might go too.
To be honest, usually the customers that hire me personally or some folks at InnoQ, they are usually in a space where those ideas usually work very well. Yeah? So I have never worked with a nuclear plant or an airplane constructor or something like that, because I think their world is very, very specific. Yeah? And I'm usually not a consultant for their market, to be honest. So I can't tell from experience from that area. I'm sorry. Yes?
I've learned a lot by that comment from you. So the failure avoidance organization, I never heard that, but it was so fully to the spot.
Yeah.
And these kind of organizations which he is talking about, they have to do CMM level 5, which is business irrelevant, but they are not allowed to fail. And it's a German mindset to always reach that state, the highest state of quality, CMM 5. But it's total bullshit. You need to fail fast and fail cheap, and this is basically CMM 4, where you iterate and where you are agile, because it's the highest business relevant maturity level. The next one is out of scope of business, because it's you're the best and you're never failing.
Yeah. There's actually a very interesting book about that. If you're interested in those things, Designing Delivery by Jeff Susna. And he compared two types of organizations. Organizations that optimize on a figure called mean time to failure, where they want to extend the level between failures. Yeah? And that's the CMM level 5 organizations. And the others where they optimize on mean time to recovery, MTTR, where they say, okay, we fail fast and we optimize on the time between the failure and the recovery. Very interesting book, to be honest. So worth a read. So Gerhard told me this sign. I'll be around for some time still, so if you want to hit me up on further questions, thanks for that. If you're interested in that, you can follow me on Twitter, @bitboss is my name, and we're also doing DDD trainings in Munich publicly, so if you're interested in that, hit me up. Thank you very much.
So, Michael, thanks
Vielen
so
Dank.
much
Thank you
for your time
Thanks.
spending with us.
It was a pleasure.
For your really interesting talk that probably will inspire some of the sessions that will come now. So, Cecilia will take over and will get us to the marketplace.
Okay, thanks for having me, folks. It was a pleasure. Thanks.